Good evening, everyone. Welcome to it's our 15th meeting. Great to see you all. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Kerry Brown. I was almost going to say welcome back, because he's the third speaker in a row who helped us enormously when we were World Affairs Digital, when I enjoyed a really interesting discussion with him in Solulite. So it's a great pleasure for me to meet him. Is the expression "in the flesh" still allowed? That's how I'm feeling. It's great for everyone here to meet Kerry in this sort of much better live environment. And I won't go through all the details of his history because you've read it for 6 months and you've seen it on the screen, being the director of the Lau Institute, which I think will introduce some, I don't know whether he'll talk about the interesting challenges of running such an institute in the United Kingdom with all the press that we see about the influence of China in all aspects of our life, including education. That's to be seen. I'm delighted he's here also because our original connection was via Isabel Hilton of our advisory panel, whom some of you may remember, who is a visiting professor at King's College London at the Lau Institute, and also the founder of China Dialogue. So this continues our interest in that world, and we are going to talk about Xi, and Kerry's latest book is Xi, A Study in Power, which is going to be very relevant today. So if you'd like to meet him at the interval, the Nantwich bookshop will be in full operation. Xi, A Study in Power, £10. And as I usually say, 220 pages, so it's not a huge tome. You'll find out everything you need to know. Go and see Kerry at the break. And so without further ado, please welcome Professor Kerry Brown.
Great. Well, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. And it's great to finally be here. And I really appreciate you coming this evening. I'll be talking about the Chinese Communist Party, this scary organization that apparently is here to brainwash us all and, kind of do nefarious things. Well, I mean, I've dealt with this organization for over 30 years in one way or another as a diplomat, working for a think tank, working as an academic. I've dealt with many officials who are from the party. Today it's, I think, 96 million members. I've written about its history and its ideology, its belief system. And so what I thought would be good in the next 40 minutes is to try and, give an idea of what this organization is. I don't think for people outside of China, it's quite the kind of terrifying existential threat that some people think it is. But it's obviously a complicated organization with a complex past. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. The man at the center of this whole story today, he's the man in the middle, Mr. Xi Jinping. I met him in 2007 in Shanghai before he had begun his great elevation. I remember it, he probably doesn't. And he is what we call a princeling. His father, actually, in the Maoist period, was a vice premier. I think he was dealing with cultural issues and propaganda. He was felled in 1961 and then spent about 19 years under house arrest. So Xi Jinping is a kind of complicated person. His background is sort of as a member of the elite that then in the 1960s and 70s during the Cultural Revolution was sent down to the countryside in a place called Yan'an in Shanxi province, central China. Apparently lived in a cave, apparently was a pig farmer. And, one kind of really wonders why he now is leading this organization and being called the kind of faithful disciple of Mao, when you think that Mao Zedong was really responsible, ultimately, for his father's suffering. I think that Xi Jinping is best understood as almost like a true believer. He's almost like a papal figure. The Chinese Communist Party is a bit like the Catholic Church in a way. It's a faith community. And it kind of isn't really about articulating dogma and, kind of very technocratic ideology. I mean, I think that's just a froth on the surface. Under Xi Jinping, it's really about what you believe. Xi Jinping is a born-again communist. He is a true believer. He's probably the last true believer in China of the Marxist-Leninist creed, because he has to believe it. I mean, if he doesn't believe it, it's a bit like the Pope not believing in the infallibility of the Pope, when we have a problem. With Xi Jinping, I mean, he really has to believe in this stuff. It's a matter of life or death. The people around him, and I'll say a bit about them in a second, they also have to believe in it. Under him, the Communist Party is really a sort of a kind of knowledge community. It's this extraordinary group of people who are in charge of China at a time when finally, after its very traumatic modern history, it is making China great again. I mean, that's the real mission. Before Trump, Xi Jinping has really sort of been on this mission to kind of create the renaissance of China, a country that was really done down, that really suffered under, kind of colonization, semi-colonization, I suppose we can call it, in the 19th century, that was really victimized by the Japanese in the 1937-45 war. I mean, this country had suffered so badly, nearly completely destroyed, and now it's got the second biggest economy in the world's largest navy. It's, kind of really become a strong, prominent thing. And not only that, to add icing to the cake, it's really getting under the skin of the United States. What's not to like, right? I mean, you start to warm to this organization, right? Just to offend any Americans in the room. I'm joking, I'm just joking. So I think that this is a very emotional kind of politics, and Xi is the sort of man at the center of it. And, kind of that's why he's a tricky figure to deal with, because in a sense, Marxism, Leninism, that sort of stuff, I don't think Chinese people, certainly my friends and colleagues in China, I don't think that has any resonance with them. But what really has resonance is this nationalistic sort of, China is now a country that is important enough, that people really take notice of it. The people around him, you'll notice, are all men. They're all of the same ethnicity, Han. They're the current Politburo. The man who is sort of, I always get this mixed up, as you're sitting there, kind of peeping right in the center. The man at the center with the glasses is a guy called Wang Huning, and I'll say a bit about him later. Rather sallow-faced guy, ex-academic. Right, there's hope for us all. Huh? And he is the ideologue. He is probably the most influential man in terms of ideology in the world today, because he has been doing this job since 1995, so incredibly important figure. I'm going to sort of just say a little bit about, the Communist Party of China is very comprehensive. We think of political parties in Britain, and we kind of think of them occupying a part of the spectrum from the left to the right, I mean, broadly. And, politicians sort of have to kind of decide, well, I think they still have to do this, where they are on that spectrum, right? And, I mean, the Communist Party of China is the whole spectrum. It's meant to be all political space. There is no organized opposition to it, no organized political party that can exist, in defiance of the party. The party is all kind of, all-seeing. On the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's foundation in 2021, Xi Jinping used this famous Maoist phrase: the party is east, west, south, north, and at the center. It's everywhere. And so it has kind of these ideological functions. What is the point of the ideology? I mean, it's quite kind of clunky and alienating. We'll say a little bit about it in a minute. But it gives the elite a common political language, a common ideological language, that precious thing of consensus. Why does that matter? Well, I guess when you've got, kind of such a diverse and complex country of 1.4 billion people, with a long history of sort of divisions, civil war, this is not an easy terrain. And what ideology, Marxist-Leninist ideology, does is kind of give them a kind of belief system that they can rhetorically kind of bow down to. It is a little bit like the way that a sort of Latin dogma, in the Middle Ages. Most people didn't have a clue what this meant, but it meant something for the elite priesthood. And in many ways, Communist Party cadres are almost like an elite priesthood. They are the kind of true believers who have to basically believe this stuff, and other people engage with it a bit like, people might go to, church and not understand what all of the stuff is going on, but they believe at some level, kind of instinctively. That's, I think, how it operates. One of the most important things about the party is that it is a strategic decision-making body. I mean, it decides general strategy, overall objectives for the whole kind of, political direction of the country. And it is a risk management entity. That's, I think, what the party really does best. It is able to really sort of prioritize where it thinks the risks are coming, because it is dealing with a terrain which is highly prone to crisis. I mean, China has been in deep and profound crises for decades. Natural crises, floods, earthquakes, even as late as 2008. Massive earthquake in Wenchuan that killed 90,000 people. Political crises, uprisings. Even 2 years ago, there was a major kind of series of demonstrations that brought about the end of the COVID restrictions. And a territory which is highly unstable. 14 neighbors. North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? Russia. I mean, this is a nasty neighborhood, right? And so you can understand why Chinese leaders are highly calculating about how they manage risk. So the party has all of these kind of functions. I put here, I mean, this is just sort of kind of reminding me, but as I've said, it's a sort of, it was initially like a state within a state. And its foundation, it kind of was constantly under threat in the 1930s and 40s. Many times it was nearly wiped out. I mean, that's why Mao Zedong's achievements were kind of incredible, because he survived, he made this body survive. And it survived by having its own military. It survived by having its own culture, its own hierarchy, its own organization, by being very self-sufficient. That made it almost like a state within a state. But it is also, as I said, a kind of cultural movement. The party has ways of doing things, ways of using language, ways of creating a mythology, a kind of narrative, a storytelling, which are highly distinctive. And some of it was borrowed from the Soviet Union, which was a big funder in the early period. But some of it is from indigenous Chinese culture, and that's really where Mao Zedong was a kind of effective innovator, because he took all of the sort of Soviet-inspired stuff and created this highly bespoke, highly unique thing. And it's still got kind of great resonance today, the kind of culture of struggle, the culture of communist nationalism in China, very, very kind of specific. You find this a lot. Chinese leaders talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, globalization with Chinese characteristics. It's all really made to suit an idea of a country which believes it's very unique and very kind of different, and culturally, it's 5,000 years, as people say, of continuous civilization is different. So in many ways, communism in China has become this sort of very strongly Chinese cultural kind of entity that identifies as the supporter of Chinese interests. Over the last 60, 70 years, ideology in China has kind of changed and adapted. Marxism, Leninism was at the root. Marxism gave, I suppose, this idea of class struggle and the idea of history being purposeful and always about, kind of dialectic development for a perfect future. And Leninism about political organization by a highly distinctive kind of, elite group of political fighters. So these were ideas that Mao took. Mao Zedong thought, I have to say, I've recently written a book on Mao Zedong, and suddenly Donald Trump makes sense. Because I have to say, if you look at Mao Zedong in his last 2 decades, I tell you, contradictions. Mao wrote this sort of famous paper in the 1937 called On Contradiction, which is, there is no problem with contradiction, saying 1 + 1 = 4, that's okay. You can be as contradictory as you like. And he kind of used that Taoist sort of approach throughout his life. He was always creating these sorts of social mobilization campaigns. I mean, he said famously, in the end of the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, there is chaos in heaven. The situation is excellent. You can imagine Trump saying that in the White House now, can't you? And, kind of this sort of very confrontational, contentious politics that, kind of was feeding off this idea that contradictions are good, to lead to a utopia. I mean, Mao Zedong was tragically a highly utopian thinker. He believed that there would be a perfect outcome, and, that created devastating kind of impact. Although I think it's true, he was an extraordinary politician, an incredible politician, but the impact of his policies was devastating. I mean, no one can really deny that, but he's still important. He has not been rejected in China. I mean, his body still sits in Tiananmen Square. Some of you may have visited it. I mean, he's still there in ways that Stalin kind of isn't in Russia. So Mao Zedong thought is still important. But really the curious thing about China in the last sort of last 40 years is that a lot of what he believed in terms of his pure ideology was repudiated by one of his colleagues for many years, Deng Xiaoping. And before 1978, China was 99% of its economy was in the hands of the central state. It didn't allow foreign capital, you could forget that. It didn't allow marketization, it didn't allow entrepreneurship. And after 1978, it broadly did. So, kind of this introduction of capitalism into China, which has had incredible success, was certainly something that was heresy before 1978. But after Deng Xiaoping started the reform and opening up, 2 years after Mao's death, the impact was incredible. The maintenance of one party having a monopoly on power, but also this kind of acceptance of a non-state sector, an acceptance of marketization, an acceptance of farmers being able to sell surplus crops back to the state at a profit. That unleashed forces of productivity that still wash over us to this day. So that was an incredible change and proved that ideology in China is really a political tool, a means to an end. It is largely about serving practical aims rather than being sort of dogmatically asserted. And, kind of as long as you can achieve certain things that are regarded as being in the national interest, like getting richer, getting stronger militarily, asserting China's, kind of primacy, that's fine. Since then, there have been other ideological forms. The one today is Xi Jinping thought for the new era. I think this is largely nationalism with a sort of strong dose of populism. And I mean, that works greatly in China. And of course, it's extremely problematic for the outside world, because I don't think Chinese nationalism has ever been an easy thing for the outside world to really embrace. Marx, Mao, and Confucius, I mean, that kind of captures the hybridity of the Communist Party's worldview. It is a real paradox that, today, the place which still really subscribes to some elements of Marxism in its governance, I mean, there's only really 5 countries, North Korea, Laos, Cuba, and China, and Vietnam, that still sort of have communist parties with a monopoly on power. I mean, China is, by way and far, the most significant. And it's weird, why Marx, because, you probably know Marx, when he wrote about it, I mean, he wrote very little about China, and a lot of it was very disdainful, like his great master, Hegel. Hegel believed, China was the archetypal, kind of backward, sort of undeveloped consciousness. You know, in his philosophy of history, he wrote Hegel about China being, you know, a place where individuation didn't exist and people were just sort of collective instruments, and you know, there was no sort of attempt to create the realization of the spirit, you know, all that kind of Hegelian language. Well, Marx subscribed to a similarly disdainful view of what he thought, he called it the Oriental despotic was, and yet today he's still really worshipped in China. I mean, it's the one place where you'll find Marxist-Leninist departments. You know, kind of, it's sort of, you know, enormous numbers of people still work on this stuff. But in fact, Mao himself had very little technical understanding of Marxism. I mean, he often referred to classical Chinese texts. Famously, you know, during the Cultural Revolution, he referred to the perfect mirror of governance by Sima Guang from the Sung dynasty 1,000 years ago. I mean, he didn't refer to Marx's texts. What he was interested in was class struggle and the idea of contradiction and dialectics. That kind of sense of a very hybrid cultural outlook, I think, has remained, and that China is, in fact, very good at appropriating and acquiring ideas and then remoulding them. And that's true of Japan and other places up to a point. But really the sort of way in which China has taken Marxism, socialism, and now capitalism and completely remolded it is quite striking. So, I mean, my bet for the future is that whatever political model China uses, and I think it will politically change, it will not resemble anything anywhere else. It will be highly unique and bespoke. And I mean, it will not be a straightforward, you know, well, yay, China's become a democracy. It will become a democracy, but probably with very specific characteristics if it does, because that's the pattern over the last 100 or so years. I won't say much about this. I'll just say about the party and the state are constantly a kind of mysterious sort of relationship. You know, in theory, there's the party with its different buildings, its different structures, and it's got its own constitution, for instance. And then there's the state, you know, 25 ministries, I think, today, with its premier, Li Qiang, and, you know, there's kind of meant to be a distinction. But, I mean, I think it's very hard these days to really tell the two apart. I think that's because Xi Jinping's, in many ways, not interested in this idea of a division between, to him, the party and the state are a harmonious, undivided one. But I also think it's because, in many ways, as I said earlier, the party has this comprehensiveness and this completeness, which we in the West find hard to understand. You know, a political party, to us, has boundaries. With the Chinese Communist Party, there are no boundaries. It's in charge of so many different ideas and different kind of frameworks, and therefore the state is its servant, definitely its servant. One of the interesting things really is about what do politicians do? You know, that's probably going to start a riot in any kind of public meeting. What do politicians do? Apart from irritate the hell out of people, you know, what do they do? What is the thing that they do? And I mean, one of the things I observed as a diplomat, you know, kind of involved in China, working in London and then in China, was we don't, in Britain, train politicians. Okay, can you imagine what that would look like, right? Keele University setting up a politicians training centre, right? I mean, it's like a kindergarten for sociopaths. So, I mean, well, sorry, this maybe, you know, this is not recorded. There's been an AI kind of, you know, getting in and, you know, taking my voice over. So, but China does train politicians. So it's always really weird to put our politicians with Chinese politicians, because our politicians, well, I think they're here to sell policy. They're here to try and persuade. They're here to kind of, you know, create. They have to speak to people's emotions, I think. That's obviously what Trump does, you know. I mean, they kind of do very sort of, they're really salespeople. But in a non-democracy like China, you don't have to sell anything, right? I mean, you just basically, you you speak, you kind of propound things, you kind of, all of the stuff that you have to do to prepare for politics in the West, you don't do in China. I mean, you won't have to choose between a left or a right or a centrist party. You just go into the Communist Party if you want a career, and that's what Xi Jinping did. In 1974, he applied 10 times to join the Communist Party. It was the only kind of show in town. That's the only career you can have. And then you basically go through this rigorous training where you have to strip out all of your, all the sort of individualism or the sort of loyalty to anything except the party. Party schools. I mean, I've taught at these places, in the past, in Shanghai and Beijing and Jingangshan and places like that. Party schools where they are going for 6 months to a year to sort of do this, kind of self-reformation. And it's a sort of intensive training process. And at the end of it, you are an administrator, a politician. But you're not ever selling policy. You are obediently implementing policy. You are absolutely loyal to the broad strategic objectives of the party. You are not there to dissent. You are there to obey. And so, in some senses, politicians in China are almost, as I said earlier, like priests in the church. They are the faithful, the most faithful of the faithful. They serve, the congregation. They are meant to believe. Not believing is not an option. It's really, as I said earlier, a faith community. So the party, and its politicians has this very, very specific function which is different to political entities in our environments. And it's always very difficult to try and convey this to, people. I remember in the past, when we had visitors from Britain, politicians, it's always a very, very difficult thing to try and sort of communicate that they're meeting politicians, but they're not the same. They have a very different kind of political culture. I think that's kind of representative of, that's kind of represents well the way in which the party and the state have this intimate, interlinked, almost indivisible relationship in China. It's like hard to kind of see where they're different, and yet on paper they're meant to be different. The State Council is meant to be the entity that governs the country at the behest of the party. Its current premier, Li Qiang, was a former party secretary of Shanghai, and there is a government body called, or a parliament, that meets, it's going to meet in about a month's time, called the National People's Congress, which has about 3,000 members. I mean, it doesn't really have any proper decision-making powers. There are ministries. There's a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs is here today. Wang Yi, he's in London. And, that part of the system is recognizable. And then it has this sort of other parts of the state, the Ministry of State Security, that are dealing with security and espionage. And they're the ones that scare the hell out of people because they're the ones that we accuse of coming and doing things abroad. And I guess, they almost certainly are. But what they're doing, no one really knows. Lots of speculation. One of the great paradoxes of China is you would have thought this system, therefore, government is everywhere. This is the image we get, that China is a place which is drenched by administration and government. But actually, the problem is often that China doesn't have too much governance, it has too little. In the actual state bureaucracy, there's 10 million officials, which sounds a lot, but in 1.4 billion people, that's way less than Britain. And so the problem is that the government actually, in terms of officials and people, is relatively small. The real problem is that those who have authority in this system are less and less and less. If I was speaking 15 years ago, I would have said there's probably 3,000 people that run China, vice ministerial level and down the provincial and central level. Today I think it's really would be staggering if we knew how many people sort of actually decided things. It's probably a few dozen, maybe even less, and that's the scary thing. That power pool has gone down and down and down. It's a highly centralized system in terms of fiscal powers. Taxation is almost all raised by the central government. I mean, it's a little bit similar to Britain in a way. It's highly centralized. And it's also mostly reliant on taxes from state enterprises, not from individuals. So that's also an incredible difference with Britain and other places where personal taxation takes the bulk of the tax burden. So this is a kind of paradoxical system. It's extremely kind of, it looks like the state and the government are very, very pervasive, but actually there are huge spaces in China where, in the past at least, anarchy prevailed, and it was very easy to kind of ignore government completely. Today, because of the enormous powers that technology has given the state, a lot of things can be done through technology to enforce the state's rules. But that's a new development. In the past, I remember living in China, it was really hard to get any kind of official, you were often told don't pester, don't bother officials, even when you had specific things, you were just told to sort it out yourself, and then you'd have to do it in a very informal way. So informality was the rule of the game in the past. I think that's less true today. There are other areas which the sort of party now controls. The military. There's a thing called the Central Military Commission, which Xi Jinping is the chair of. He's the chair of lots of these things. It has about 12 other military figures on it. You probably read in the papers about the military in China being bashed up by an anti-corruption struggle recently. One of the problems with the Communist Party in the past was, and that's really one of the ways that Xi Jinping rose to power, that when China was having massive growth in the 2000s, after it joined the World Trade Organization, officials were just siphoning off billions. It was corruption left, right, and center. And the party, kind of had to try and get a grip on this because that it was losing its moral mandate really quickly. Xi Jinping complained that, people shouldn't go into politics to do business, they should go into politics to do politics. But I mean, it was precisely to make money that people went into politics, and those days are over now because of these massive anti-corruption campaigns where he's stripped out all of the most venal people, who are taking massive amounts of backhanders and money. The Central Military Commission and the army, therefore, have been bashed up by these big, big anti-corruption moves. The Minister of Defense, Li Shangfu, from a year ago, was removed after a month a couple of years ago, because of the fact that he was in charge of this thing called the Ballistics Mobilization Group or something. Before he became Minister of Defense, they had been given multi-billion budget, and yet when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan and China protested by letting off a few kind of hyper-technological ballistic missiles, about 5 of them didn't go off because the money had been misappropriated and the kit was no good. And therefore, Mr. Li Shangfu has disappeared. His performance development review obviously didn't go very well. The same happened to actually I knew him, Qin Gang, the foreign minister. He was removed very, very quickly. So, kind of, this is a system which is very unforgiving for people when there are these kind of problems, and the military has definitely been reined in. It's important, though. The military, it's a massive military. It's got lots of new kit. It is untested, though. It hasn't had combat experience for many years. I mean, that's the weird thing. Chinese, the People's Liberation Army has not been deployed since 1979 abroad in Vietnam, and not really internationally since the Korean War in the early 50s. So this is an untested military, and I think that must be something that really sort of troubles the Chinese leadership. The final thing I'll talk about is my good friend Wang Huning. There he is, staring spectrally over the shoulder of Mr. Xi and his wife, the singer Peng Liyuan. I mean, what's sort of really important today is the nature of Chinese politics. This is an era in which, because of the influence of this man, Wang Huning, China really believes it has the answer to the most critical question in politics today, and that is, who are we? Who are we? It believes that for Chinese, the answer to that is we are people who have had a cultural continuity of 5,000 years. We are a people who have been coherent and cohesive for many, many generations, and who are finally on the pathway to modernity on our own terms after a history of terrible suffering in the modern times. And that is a moment of redemption. It is our moral right to rise again and be a central power. And we therefore know who we are, and we have cultural confidence. And we also understand the importance in terms of security in knowing who you are and knowing who you're not. Well, Wang Huning was a visitor in the United States briefly in 1989. And he was an academic then at Fudan University. And he wrote, a couple of years after that visit, a book which you can find online in the translation called America Against America. And that is probably one of the most prophetic books that's been written in the last 40 years. I'm not saying this is this is not my opinion, this is what Wang Huning wrote in that book. He wrote that he really admired American power, the constitutionalism in America. He admired many things about America, but he made a prediction that this was a country that did not know who it was. And it was beset by divisions about its identity, by a kind of lack of real kind of cultural coherence. And he felt that this was something that China could not do. China could not do it because it had experienced profound divisions in the Republican period in which it had been beset by massive fights between the nationalists and the communists, culminating in the Civil War, and that had nearly destroyed the country. So for Wang Huning, the key issue for politics was not about the economy or about security per se, it was about culture. Under Xi Jinping, therefore, we have this strong investment in the idea of a kind of cultural politics, a cultural revolution, if you want to call it that, in which the country kind of feels this sense, and it's promoted by the government, that the Communist Party is the custodian of that cultural mission. That's why I think it's very difficult to look at the Communist Party in a sort of very straightforward way as a nasty, communist, one-state behemoth. I mean, it isn't an easy organization. I don't think, in my engagement with it, although I've had plenty of pleasant interactions with party officials, and over the years, I've learned to respect many people in it and found them hardworking, and, on that level, I don't kind of think it's the scary, big, terrifying thing that people think it is, but I do think that it's clearly not an easy organization for one to just dismiss as a standard autocracy. I mean, Xi Jinping is not probably a popular leader in terms of how he has been the custodian of the economy. He's not probably a popular leader in terms of how he's closed down debate and all public space in China. I mean, my students, my colleagues in China, my Chinese friends who are now based here, many are very, very disturbed by the way in which he has annexed all space. But on the other hand, they also feel that China's status in the world needs to be improved, and they feel that China has a right to a certain strategic kind of status, and that this sort of nationalistic populism in that sense is it's understandable. It reaches many people's emotions and it kind of mobilizes them. And so I think it's kind of very tough these days to condemn China and the Communist Party on the one hand for being authoritarian and all these things. you can say all those things. But to me, the more interesting question is, how does this politics work? And why is it that, kind of today, in a world which is so different to the one that Mao Zedong, created the power of the party, the Communist Party is still in power? I think finally, there is probably an unsettling answer to that partly, and that is because to be honest, since 2008, and I remember this process, I remember being part of this, China has lost faith in models from the outside world. I remember in the 90s, people I talked to in China often were respectful and thought that democracy was a good thing and that the systems they saw in Europe and America had many things they wanted to emulate. I think they did look up to people. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union had a massive impact because they felt that the West foisted on Russia a terrible set of ideas that led to a collapse in human development levels in Russia in the 90s, Yeltsin, the chaos of that period. They felt that this was a disaster. And they made a real resolution then to make sure that they did never, ever, ever emulate what Russia did then, and do not listen to foreigners and their ideas about, kind of political models. In 2008, the economy was the issue. I think despite the political issues in Russia, China still felt, as far as, good practitioners of capitalism, the West was still worth looking at. But with the economic crisis, if you remember, and the massive problems that came from that, and the fact that China had to kind of get European governments like the Greeks coming and begging it for bailouts, it just thought, wow, not only are you awful at politics, you people, but you're really lousy capitalists too. We're so disappointed. And I think that explains the geopolitical background for Xi Jinping. Without that, I don't think he would have risen the way he has. So today, we kind of live in this very paradoxical situation that probably the world's most pure practitioner of capitalism is Mr. Xi Jinping and his government. Capitalism without labor rights, capitalism with absolute, real kind of commitment to the shareholders' value, Communist Party, enormous sense of making profit. I mean, the Communist Party is probably the world's most successful, profit-making entity. I mean, it puts other things like Elon Musk to complete shame. He's only worth $500 billion. This is like 18 trillion, right? They're completely focused on the bottom line. And so I just think that this sort of picture is very, very kind of symbolic because you have Mr. Xi smiling in the front, but behind him, you have the sallow looks of the great ideologue and a man who has influenced your life without you knowing it, Mr. Wang Huning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. What a welter of questions have been generated by this most interesting and challenging talk. And broadly speaking, I will try to get the questions that are about China that are more to do early on with being a citizen and what it's like living there, that sort of stuff. And then we'll move more into the China's influence around the world and its international relationships. But forgive me if I can't quite do that totally efficiently because you've put in so many questions, as you can see. I'm going to start off with law. So Joe Sexton asks, where does the judiciary fit in? And Jenny Hartley, how is civil law made in China? Who interprets it, i.e. decides cases, and who enforces it? Could we have some quick thoughts on that?
Sure, yeah. Obviously, the law is completely under the party. There's no surprise there. So they have a kind of idea, so it's not rule of law, it's rule by law. So the idea is that they don't want a situation like they feel sometimes in other places where courts are very powerful and can have influence over politicians. The party is not accountable to any courts. However, I think they have kind of set up since 1979 largely on the Japanese and German system, actually, ironically, not the sort of British system, the kind of continental system, this kind of amazing set of laws. And under Xi Jinping, there's been kind of far more observance of these laws in commercial areas, but not, you would not get many favors if you started kind of talking about the constitutional rights to freedom of expression if you said that Xi Jinping was, like a nasty person. No, you wouldn't get off for that. So it's very patchy, but I think as long as it's in commercial and economic areas, the Chinese legal system now functions relatively okay. It is also slightly changed because it used to be that courts were funded by the same level of government. So in provinces, they were funded by the provincial government, and in kind of prefectures, they're called, which is the other lower down, they're funded by the prefecture, and that caused all sorts of conflicts of interest because courts were not likely to bite the hand that fed them. And now it's changed so the courts are funded by the level of government above. So there's a division, a little bit of a division of powers. And finally, in terms of judges, in the past, judges were almost all completely novices. I mean, in the beginning, in the 80s, as China was building this legal system, it was mostly people who were ex-military or ex-officials and no knowledge of the law at all. And now, in fact, the country has plenty of lawyers, probably more lawyers than Britain, but very few that deal with political issues. I mean, under Xi Jinping, that kind of area has been completely crushed. So, it's not right to say that China is a place with no rule by law, but it's also pretty clear that law is a tool for the party and its political purposes and must be loyal. It must be absolutely loyal. So all judges are members of the party.
I'm going to give you a series of questions, read them out, so you can then... This is all about what it's like to be a citizen in China, and you'll be able to respond. Ian Duadell says, well, what's it like for the man in the street? Millions come to the West for holidays and then go back. Cheryl asks, what do the ordinary Chinese know about the Western world? Do they have, internet access? Any restrictions on their travel? And Alistair Duncan, China operates a system of citizen point scoring whereby privileges are granted or withdrawn according to good or bad behavior. Alistair wonders whether that can make to work here, so maybe he's interested in that approach. But Faye Lambert wonders, and bearing that in mind, are people living in China happy?
Yeah. I mean, the last one, there is a global happiness score, isn't there? And every year Finland comes out as number one, so, they can take that as seriously as you want. I guess the issue about what people feel, what people think, it's a country of 1.4 billion people. And there are opinions left, right, and center, and it's hard to categorize. In terms of, this is a country that has developed hugely over the last 30 years, 40 years, in ways which are very disorientating. Almost every day there's changes. You go back to a place, I did it in the past when the economy was really booming, and you would go to a place, and a year later you go back, and it had been rebuilt. And there was a bunch of Harvard researchers who did this thing on deep China, which is, the China of the inner life. What are the inner lives of Chinese people? And you get enormous incidences of mental health issues, a big rise in depression, enormous pressures on people, peer group pressures, not dissimilar to the kind of pressures that people have felt in the West. I guess China's learnt that capitalism makes you wealthier and makes you live longer and also kind of drives you insane. And so I think that this is what China has sort of been through, this enormous cultural and inner revolution. In terms of knowledge levels, I think now Chinese people are well informed mostly about the outside world. On the whole, news about things that don't specifically relate to China is okay in China. It's usually fairly objective. I mean, of course, it's completely different about the system internally. That is highly propagandistic, and I think people know that. I mean, Chinese people mostly know, they're very aware of that. The internet has been controlled. I mean, we used to sort of go on in the good old days, you know, in the late 90s about how the internet was going to bring democracy and freedom to China. I mean, that didn't happen. We thought it was awful that China banned Facebook, that it banned, as it was called then, Twitter. I mean, I have to say these days, these things seem to me eminently sensible. You know, it's got its own versions of these things, but the internet is controlled. I mean, there's very big, you know, kind of restrictions. Hilariously, a friend of mine, rather unhelpfully, sent me, they asked, oh God, what's it called? Chat GPT or whatever it's called. They asked, what should I ask Kerry Brown? And it kind of said, you should ask him about politics in China, you should ask him about this and that. And it asked DeepSeek, the Chinese version, what should I ask Kerry Brown? It said, I don't understand the question. Yeah, so they're not so dumb, right? So I think there's obviously very big controls. The social credit score, which was referred to, is imperfect. People talk about this, and The Economist magazine goes on about there is this big system. If you don't have the right social credit score, you can't, you know, get on planes. Actually, it's been incredibly difficult to roll this out. You know, there's been all sorts of issues. Some provinces have been doing it, some haven't. As far as I know, a colleague of mine works on this in King's College. It's pretty messy. It is meant to work almost in the same way that, you know, when you have your insurance, there are all sorts of factors that go in that are very, very specific, and you're given a sort of judgment, are you reliable or not? In the West, it's interpreted as being incredibly, you know, kind of invasive. But I certainly, my Chinese colleagues and friends tell me that they haven't found it particularly helpful because it's very, very poorly implemented. It might be different in the future, but on the whole, it's not something that people think about. The average person tends to think about, why is it that I'm working long hours, not being well paid? Why is it that the environment is not particularly clean these days? Why is it that, you know, our mortgage payments have gone through the roof? So not dissimilar to the middle class anywhere else, or anyone anywhere else.
Can we just pick up on the middle class? There have been several questions about that. Linda Sherwood, is the emergence of the huge Chinese middle class a direct result of Xi's policies? She wonders how it's happened. We've got other questions, of course, that wonder whether the improved education and the rise of the middle classes might lead to more of a threat or a challenge to Xi and the party's approach.
Yeah, I mean, the middle class in how you define it, some people say there's 500 million people who fall into that category in China. Other people say it's less, other people say it's more. I mean, per capita, China's GDP is about $13,000 now. I mean, a very small amount compared to the United States or here, for instance. But there's a lot of inequality. So there are billionaires. There's more billionaires than America, apparently. But, you know, there's also entrenched, not absolute poverty. That was apparently eradicated a couple of years ago. But certainly people who are living on $2 or $3 a day. I mean, so not doing particularly well. The middle class, if you define them as service sector working with probably their own property, urban living, I mean, that's now over 60% of the country's urban, which is historically unprecedented. It was, when I first went to China in 1991, it was only 10% of people lived in cities. So now there's 60% living in cities. So, you know, these people are aspirational. Are they going to be a political problem? Well, I guess when the pandemic happened and the very fierce lockdowns in China, in Shanghai and places like this, well, towards the end, you'll probably remember the A4 uprising, we called it, or protests. The middle class broadly came out on the streets and protested. And the government responded within a week and scrapped all of the restrictions. So if Xi Jinping has a base, it's this middle class. They're the people that he has to serve, and he has to keep them on side. And while at the moment there doesn't look like a kind of big momentum of dissatisfaction leading to protest and then revolution, I mean, that's happened in Chinese history plenty of times, so no government is complacent. The Chinese government is obsessed by public opinion, not in the way that we are with media and, you know, kind of social media. The Chinese government does many focus groups. It keeps constant tabs on what's sort of going online on Chinese social media. It's always trying to preemptively deal with problems, either by negotiation or by trying to sort of buy its way out. If that fails, then by repression. But repression is expensive. I mean, it's very expensive. And so actually the middle class is latently quite powerful, but so far it's kept online, I think, by the nationalism, which it likes about the Xi era, and, you know, the fact that the party is trying to be responsive to people's needs. So that's kind of, you know, not what we hear in the outside world, but I don't hear, when I go to China, a lot of people overtly complain about how life is, but they certainly have big expectations, and they are getting more frustrated because the economy is slowing down.
Thank you. I'm going to pose some questions broadly about culture, and then I'm going to follow up with wealth, economy, and capitalism, broadly in that order. So, cultural type questions. So, Ian Duerdoth wonders whether it's relevant that, unlike the US, the population of China is very uniform, you know, 90%, and I think is the figure. And Rod Mitchell actually is asking about language, and he wonders what proportion people speak Mandarin, and maybe that's a unifying factor. Nick Sharman, on the other hand, wants you to say more about Xi Jinping thought. Despite what you've said in the talk, he wonders, what is it? So you might want to clarify there. And Jeff Elliott's been a bit provocative. So he says, is there an identifiable Chinese culture? Although you've tried to explain this to us. If there is, in such a vast nation, he wonders whether the party is using it, supporting it, or really subverting it.
Yeah, I mean, on the uniformity of the country, I mean, it's true that 94% of people say that they're Han ethnicity, but within that group, there's massive diversity, and if you travel around, I don't feel it's not a country that seems very uniform in a way. I mean, there's massive differences. So the Han are sort of almost like saying you're European in a way. I mean, it kind of, the difference between people in Sichuan province and Hunan or Henan province or Heilongjiang province in the north is quite considerable. That is related a bit to language because all of these places did have different dialects, markedly different dialects. They shared the same writing system. That's across the whole Chinese-speaking world, including Taiwan and Hong Kong and of course, the Chinese diaspora. So that's a great unifier because that's, you know, beyond the difference between traditional and simplified characters, it's the same. Everywhere you go, you can read Chinese, and even the dialect is impenetrable. But the dialects are hugely different, and yeah, I can't understand Cantonese. That's a dialect in a way. I mean, it's meant to be a different language, but it's actually a dialect. And I can't understand Sichuan, heavy accent. And, you know, kind of in many areas, the accent, you can kind of understand it, but it's extremely difficult. So standard Mandarin is often the exception, not the norm. People still, you know, have differences. But on the whole, because of media and, you know, kind of just the fact that people are hearing far more people speak standard Mandarin, that's the kind of lingua franca now. Most people understand that. Almost everyone understands that. Xi Jinping thought, well, what is it? Well, it's not so much what it is, but what it does. I mean, it's, you know, kind of really meant to be focused on practical outcomes, i.e., the party's unity, the fact that the party's meant to be this sort of, you know, redemptive body that is delivering this nationalistic make China great again. Xi Jinping thought is broadly a way of giving officials and cadres a kind of framework that they work in, where they have things like common prosperity, i.e. they want more equality and equity in society. They have things like, this idea of dual circulation, China becoming quite economically nationalistic, serving China's aims. They have things like the China dream, that's part of Xi Jinping thought, which is this sort of emotional idea that now Chinese people, after being, kind of suffering economically and politically in modern history, are now able to kind of dream about the sort of lifestyles that people in the West have had and are having. So it is a sort of aspirational ideology. It's extremely hard to pin it down, though. It's often in Xi Jinping, when he talks about this stuff, he kind of comes out with big, long lists. But I think really it's about the thing that it's been about, even before Xi Jinping thought, which is practice is the criteria of truth, right? I mean, you kind of have to practice things, and then you create justification for them. So it's sort of pragmatic. Xi Jinping thought is also assertion of the absolute dominance of the party. I mean, that's what it is at heart. It's a statement about the fact that without the party, the country will perish. So, that's, I think, really what it is built on. Is there an identifiable Chinese culture? I mean, of course, the party is highly opportunistic in how it uses Chinese culture, I mean, of course. And the way in which it manipulates that in propaganda and elsewhere is, kind of sort of very, very striking. It is not easy now for writers in China or for artists like Ai Weiwei, who's now living abroad, and others to sort of, kind of be more adventurous and more avant-garde with Chinese culture. It's quite conservative. Xi Jinping is quite puritanical, and he doesn't really sort of like, kind of art which doesn't serve socialist principles. But I think that if there's anything the Chinese culture, there's two things that I understand. One is that Chinese culture is really about the power of the power of family. I mean, it's a very family-centered culture. I mean, that's really where people have their main social networks. It's, kind of in trust surveys, who do you trust in China? Up till recently, it was really people didn't trust officials, they didn't trust business people, they didn't trust anyone, really. They didn't trust neighbors, and they certainly didn't trust foreigners, but they trusted their family. I mean, 95% trusted their family. And I suppose the second thing about Chinese culture is it's very syncretic. I mean, it's got these three great teachings, right? Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. They live side by side with each other. It's an interesting history over the last 2,000 years without religious wars. I mean, it's quite different to Europe, and a kind of ability to balance these quite different thought systems with enormous flexibility. So I think that's really striking about my understanding of the sort of the Chinese mindset. It isn't really about having an idea of the truth with a capital T. It's sort of about kind of accepting that you have to hold things in balance sometimes that are quite contradictory, and Mao used that in his theory on contradiction. So I would say that that's a distinctive feature of Chinese culture. It's hybridity. I've always been very struck by that.
Broadly, well, roughly cultural, I suppose, are the following questions. Jan Ferguson, what percentage of the pool of power is made up of women? And Julia Wilson, China seems a very male-dominated society, especially in leadership circles. What would you say is the role of women in this society?
Well, I mean, I'm sure everyone's delighted to have a man pontificate about this and mansplain the role of women in China. I mean, the party is 25% women. And the leadership, it's gone down under Xi Jinping. So in the past, there were, in the Central Committee, which is the 300 super elite, maybe, 40 women. And now I think it's about 20. I mean, it's gone down. In the Politburo, the absolute super elite, which is currently 7 people, no women. There's never been a woman in the Politburo, ever, since 1949. Mao Zedong actually was a strong supporter of feminism in the beginning, and his famous phrase, women hold up half the sky. But in practice, it is an extremely, it seems to me, as an outsider, and my colleagues, from China kind of feel this too, it is very male-dominated. In business, that's less so. There have been successful women business people or female business people. The party about 10 years ago said, kind of at that point made a legal change where it said that being gay wasn't a mental illness. I mean, until then it had said that, if you were gay, it was a mental illness. So it made that change. But I think that feminists and gay rights activists in China in the last 10 years have had a pretty terrible time. There were feminist protests in 2016, I think, and they were, crushed. So you would say that China today is pretty, I wouldn't say misogynistic. I mean, I think it is male-dominated. I mean, the statistics show that very clearly.
Money. Several, we'll look at this very briefly, if we may, because there's so much more to cover. Vivap's got Gill. I don't know whether she's got aspirations, but how do you become wealthy in China today? Mike Hill. How have the super rich in China become super rich in a communist state? Was it corruption? So he's wondering whether it really is a true communist state. So would you like to explore that conundrum briefly, and then we'll move on to the economy and other questions?
Well, I mean, the people who become, so the wealthiest man in China, it's a man at the moment, a wealthiest man in China runs the Nongfu spring water company, this bottled water. In the past, it was Jack Ma Yun of Alibaba, who ran a kind of Chinese version of Amazon. There are people who make a lot of money in telecoms, Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, the owner of that. They all have to have very good strategies to deal with the state. In the past, you had much more space. In the 80s and 90s, entrepreneurs could, had much more latitude. But the state enterprises always had the upper hand. So Chinese entrepreneurs are incredible people. They're very creative. They have to constantly kind of walk a tightrope. The super rich, as I said, there are more billionaires in China than America in numerical terms, though that has fallen in the last couple of years because of Xi Jinping's obsession with equity and the idea that having super rich is not good. You've got to have more kind of balance. And so to be rich in China today is something where you have to really keep your mouth shut. You make your money and you don't make a big ostentatious show of it. In the 2000s, I remember it wasn't a problem. You would have people who would brag to you about how they just bought, they bought Ferraris like they'd gone around a supermarket and got, kind of Kit Kats. It was just incredible. Now you don't do that. There is still an enormous amount of wealthy people, and they still mostly do that by having relationships with either state companies or state patrons. They have to be very careful because they don't want to be associated with corruption. There have been business people in the last few years who've been swept up by the anti-corruption purge. But on the whole, there is still space in China, and it's still regarded as important to have entrepreneurs, and people are still making money. The sectors today tend to be real estate. That's always been a kind of really big money spinner, and energy, and well, as we saw from DeepSeek, AI. I mean, companies, kind of dealing with AI. I mean, massively successful. That guy was 27, wasn't he? I mean, very geeky. I mean, he did apparently, this sort of company on a prayer, wing and a prayer, and it's now worth billions. So, people are definitely moving into innovation.
We've got some questions about the economy and Chinese economy, and there are doubts amongst the audience. So I'll just give you the flavour, and you might like to give a sort of summary answer. So, Chris Nibbs, if China are the world's best capitalists, how come their economy is suffering? No longer 7% growth. Derek Miller, if China's massive holding of US debt, is that massive holding of US debt an asset or a liability? It's an opportunity or a threat. Graham Daly, Chinese economic growth seems to be based exclusively on export consumption, not domestic consumption. What might happen if there's a severe downturn as a result of, for instance, tariffs? Would there be instability? And finally, we've got, if China's got capitalism sorted out, how come they've had such a terrible crisis with a collapsed property market destroying many individuals? Can you sort of tease out a few thoughts there?
When I said China was an effective capitalist, I wasn't particularly defending capitalism. I mean, what I mean is it's a very pure form of capitalism which does not recognize labor rights and just puts state profit at the peak of everything. And I mean, I don't think that's good, but I think China has been effective until recently in just pumping out GDP growth and delivering for state enterprises. I mean, you know, the figures speak for themselves. But I think people are right. In the last few years, it's become more difficult. Firstly, you can't keep growing your economy at 10% a year. And secondly, you know, there's all sorts of structural issues in the Chinese economy, local government debt, high youth unemployment, the property market, it's just been alluded to. So I think it's going through a tough time. When I was in China last year, most people were very pessimistic. They felt that the government didn't really have a plan. I suppose the thing that's different is that the Chinese government has one asset that no one else has, and it's the greatest economic asset on the planet. It was alluded to in the question about consumption. Chinese domestic consumption is about a third of GDP. It's always been that level. As long as I've been dealing with China, the big problem is how to make Chinese people spend. Lack of social welfare, an imperfect health system, where only 6% of kind of GDP is in healthcare, and I think in America it's 18%. In Britain, even it's double, about 12%. So Chinese people, I think, are always saving for when problems happen because they know that won't be a lot of support, and so they haven't historically been spenders. And I guess what the Chinese government is desperately trying to do now is to make the consumption rise up. If that were to rise by a few percentage points, there would be good growth. I mean, it would be magic. They just have to do that, but it's not easy. People feel very risk averse at the moment. I guess that's going to be at the heart of what America and China do in terms of a trade deal. I mean, I think if you're sitting in Beijing today, every day you look at a news from America and it must cheer you up. And I'm aware that, American politics is my area, so I'm not, you'll be relieved to know that I will not be giving you my views on that because I don't, it's not my area. For China, though, what they see in America are, they see all the evidence that and they might be wrong about this. I mean, I'm not saying they're right, but I think they see this proves the decline that they always thought would happen. They see an America declining. That's what they think they see. And I think the second thing is that they see in Trump, this is their view, I'm not saying this is true, the world's perfect sucker. They see someone who is just going to come at them with a deal. And I think they're really ready for this. And the only problem is that they're going to screw him over too hard. I think even he will not put up with the pain that they're about to inflict. Why? Because I think that they're going to kind of obviously think it is okay to engage with America in a different way if it answers the issues about Chinese domestic consumption. If America can kind of offer things where that consumption is rising, new goods, new ways of doing things, and America gets a deal out of it, I think that they would be happy with that. And I think that's what they're going to try and do. I don't know if the administration in Washington has a clear idea of what it wants. All I know is obviously that Trump is, kind of very keen on, this big deal being possible, a new trade deal, like trade deal 1. And so if that works in ways which raise Chinese consumption, I guess that's going to be a big kind of energizer for the Chinese economy. But it's right, at the moment, the property market in Shanghai is down a third. 70% of household wealth is in property, which is more than, in Britain. It has been depressed for a while. I am hesitant to say that this is going to be a big systemic issue, because if I've heard, if I'd been given £1 in the last few years by people who told me the Chinese economy was about to tank, I would be as wealthy as Elon Musk now. It's just that every year for 30 years I've heard the Chinese economy is about to collapse, and it didn't. I may be complacent, I may be wrong, there may be a big recession on its way, I don't know. If there is a big recession, just finally, that is a China we haven't seen for 50 years, if that. China in recession, there's not been a day in the last decades, really since the Cultural Revolution, because there was even growth then, in which China has been in negative growth. So politically, that is a place that I don't know what it looks like, because this great middle class, well, they're loyal on 5% growth, but they're a bit less loyal on 4% growth. They're really, really flaky on 1% growth, and their loyalty disappears like a puff of smoke when it's 0 or below. So that, if that happens, will be a China that I can't tell you much about, because it's never existed in modern decades.
You've given us quite a few comments already on Trump, but we've got lots of questions about Trump versus China. I'm just going to give you the flavour of them, and some are a bit more specific. John King, will there be champagne in Beijing following Trump's overtures to Putin in the last 24 hours? Ian Brown says differently. Considering the chaos Trump's creating and his fear of China, should Xi be contrarian and support Ukraine, forcing Trump to reconsider his priorities? That's a curious thought for you to consider. Sarah Ivan Dickey, has Donald Trump's behavior towards Ukraine given the green light to China to invade Taiwan? And we've got another question. What will Xi make of Musk and his role in relation to Trump? And how will this influence how they play, how China plays its part in all this?
Wow, okay. So Putin, I think that Xi Jinping has been to China, been to Russia, a huge number, 40 times or something in the last 12 years. It's the place he's been to most often. No, Xi Jinping and Putin have met 40 times in the last 12 years. So more than any other leader. I believe that their relationship one-to-one is good, but Russia is a sixth the size of the Chinese economy. This is not an equal relationship, right? I think that China will support Russia because it's its big land neighbor, because, they're not kind of allies of the West, so, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Do they really get on? I went to Moscow about 4 or 5 years ago and talked about China, and I don't think that they're particularly happy with this big relationship with China. There's a lot of historic suspicion, and they're always obsessed, by the way, that China wants to retake Siberia. So I don't think it's a trusting relationship. Ukraine, I don't think that Xi will support Ukraine. I think that that's what they want to do, is basically be part of any reconstruction. They have important energy interests in Ukraine, so I think they'll be looking for opportunities. They, I think, probably want this conflict to end. I think that they think it's a big distraction, because I think, to be honest, China has colossal disdain for Russia and thinks that they are a laboratory of failure, and that this is just not a serious it's not an appropriate country. They are sort of still really believing that America is a superpower, a great power, and they at least respect that. So I think that they don't really think that they're going to pay a big cost to support Putin. That's not on their cards. I think that they will probably want this conflict to end, but not in a way that Russia looks like it's lost. They'll want a draw. I don't know if that's possible, but that's what they'll want. They don't want to kind of come down too heavily on one side over the other. Invade Taiwan. Well, I've just written a book on this. It's out with Penguin Random House. The China Story, in all good bookshops, and particularly one in Nantwich. So, you know, I don't think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is anything comparable to the Chinese situation in Taiwan. Firstly, it's going to be an amphibious attack. If it's a military attack, that's not easy. Secondly, it's going to be the world's second economy. And Taiwan, which produces hugely important semiconductors, you've probably got some of them in your phones and stuff here. I mean, if there is conflict, then the whole world's supply chains are smashed apart, and it will bring China against America, because America will get involved, almost certainly. This will be a global war. I mean, this is not something we should dally with. So I don't think that China, at the moment, will invade Taiwan. Two things will be the red lines. One is a Taiwanese president who says unilaterally that Taiwan is independent. That's very unlikely. Lai Ching-te, the current president of Taiwan, is one of the most overtly supportive of independence, but he definitely won't say Taiwan is independent. The other is America saying we don't, observe the one China policy anymore. We recognize Taiwan as an independent entity, an independent state. I don't think under Marco Rubio that they'll do that. He is sensible. He said to Wang Yi last week, that who's the Chinese foreign minister, we don't recognize an independent Taiwan. What America does recognize is an outcome where if both sides agree for reunification, it happens. That's not likely to happen anytime soon, and maybe never. Or that if both sides agree to become independent and they can put up with that, as long as it's reciprocal and everyone agrees, then they'll go along with that. So they try and be neutral. Elon Musk, what does China think of Elon Musk? I mean, they like his investment in Shanghai. They're really keen on that. I mean, you know, he's extremely keen on China. His influence in America, I don't know what they make of that. I mean, I think that they respect business people. Ironically, the Chinese government is quite respectful of business people, especially really, really big business people. So I think that they regard his closeness to Trump as is useful. This is a person with a vested interest in China who will probably be a moderating influence. I think they'll think that that's probably pretty helpful.
Quick touch on the UK interests comes in two ways. June is wondering how we in Britain reconcile ourselves with the terrible consequences for some Hong Kong citizens since we handed it back. And even closer to home, Bob Winter, how much of a security threat would the planned super Chinese embassy be?
Right. On Hong Kong, I mean, sure, the retrocession happened in 1997, and there was a 50-year understanding. What no one foresaw then was that China would develop as fast as it did economically. I mean, in 1997, Hong Kong was a quarter the size of the Chinese economy. Today, it's less than 2%. And if you think that the Chinese economy has just exploded, it quadrupled in size between 2001 and 2012, no one expected that. So, in a sense, the reason why Hong Kong is sort of in this disequilibrium position is, I think that the idea was that things would go more slowly, that 50 years of sort of like the whole process where Hong Kong would maintain its current, political system and its current economic system, this would be something that would have to be observed for China's interests. And, I mean, that hasn't happened. China's developed far more quickly and not democratized. I mean, that's the other thing that people may have expected in 1997 but didn't happen, and hasn't happened, and I don't think it's likely to happen anytime soon, if ever. We have to remember UK policy historically is, it's focused on Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is a part of our relationship. It's not everything. And I kind of sometimes think it's got a slightly distorting impact because, America, they kind of don't have to deal with the issues around Hong Kong. I mean, they talk about them sometimes, but they're just talking about bilateral issues. They deal with it more holistically. We tend to, kind of really prioritize Hong Kong in many ways. And You know, as I say, I mean, that's part of the story. It's an important part of the story, but it's not the whole part of the story. On the new Chinese embassy, I mean the Royal Mint or whatever in London, only thing, and I don't know the answer to this, I mean, I don't think it's a security issue so much as I remember in 2000 when I served at the British Embassy in Beijing, we had a person there full-time working on the new British Embassy in China, right? I go back last August, and I go to this building, which is the same building I used to work at in 2000, right? And there is still someone there working on, you know, the new Chinese embassy, right? What a perfect job, you know, and probably the same person. I didn't recognize them, but, you know, I don't know, I mean, a quarter of a century. I don't know whether we will be getting a new location. I don't know if any of you have been to Beijing and seen our embassy. It is a very small building, far too many people in it, and it's not fit for purpose. I would have thought that if we get a reciprocal deal in a decent building, I mean, the Americans moved out of a similar building 18 years ago, 15, 18 years ago. They have this huge new building in the new embassy district. We have less space than the Romanian embassy, than the Albanian embassy. I mean, that's huge. And we always look opposite and think, why don't we just take that place over, you know, and have a diplomatic incident? And we didn't, obviously. But now I come to think of it, maybe we should do that. But, you know, it seems to me it should be reciprocal. But I don't think at the moment this is being talked about in terms of this new embassy. It seems the Chinese will maybe have their big, you know, spanking new embassy, and we'll still have this broom cupboard in Beijing. And I think that's really, really, that I don't understand.
Two quick areas. They're big subjects, but if we wouldn't mind. They've got a lot of questions. I'm skipping, I'm afraid, all the human rights questions. But we discussed...
Sounds like Xi Jinping, huh?
Yes, absolutely. I thought you might have a lot to say about it.
I feel at home. I feel like I'm back in China.
We have covered them in the past. This question is about Belt and Road Initiative, and there are several of them, and broadly speaking, right, I'll read out Stephen Booth's first line of his lengthy question, which is China's Belt and Road Initiative colonialism without flags? And that sums up broadly the other questions we've got.
No, I don't think it is. Actually, the Chinese government is less in favour of this now than it was a few years ago. When I was in China last year, I didn't see much about the Belt and Road. I think their experiences have been very mixed. In Sri Lanka, they were blamed for debt trap diplomacy with the port there, but I don't think that they plan to take responsibility for these projects when governments, you know, screwed up on their debt repayment. So I think they didn't really want to get sucked into that. They had huge potential commitments in Pakistan. Again, I was in Pakistan about 18 months ago. Well, good luck with that, right? I mean, if you invest there, you're going to have an interesting life. I mean, you know, not many Chinese there, very security conscious, and 60 billion, you know, US dollars committed to ports and things, but I don't really see the Chinese getting the returns they wanted. So the Belt and Road sort of is probably less than the sum of its parts. I mean, I don't think it's quite given them what they wanted, so I don't think it's colonization under a different flag. I think that they are quite interested now in the fact that in the global south, we used to call it, in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Central Asia, they now have alternative markets for things like Huawei because they've been blocked out of Europe and America, and you know that gives them huge markets. And on the whole, they're able to be very transactional. They're super transactional. I think they really, really kind of like that. So I don't find the Belt and Road as scary as some people find it. I think Chinese investment abroad is increasingly in Africa, Latin America, and some in India, not much. But these are not easy territories to invest. So I think China has, you know, kind of really not quite had the easy route it thought it had by using its money to get influence abroad. I mean, you know, in the kind of Asia-Pacific region too, it's been accused of interfering in politics in some places, but the outcomes have sometimes not been in its favour. I think it's likely to be more cautious in the future because it does not want, with its domestic issues, distractions abroad and big kind of commitments. I don't think it's a power that does not want big responsibilities, I don't think.
We're going to finish broadly where you came in with two questions, and you give us a thought. Andrew Church is wondering how on earth can 24 people, or however many it was you said, run and control all aspects of China? He's very puzzled. And Jeremy Turner, if Xi goes under a bus, will your wonderful Mr. Wang replace him?
Oh, Lord, no. No. If Xi goes under a bus, I think they all suddenly throw themselves after him. I mean, the succession issue is actually a problem. I mean, Xi Jinping is now 72. And so, there's a Congress in 2 years' time, 2027, where usually you'd expect some kind of successor to appear, and I don't think it's likely there will be. There's sort of so how do people, 24 people run the country? Well, I mean, in a sense, the politicians are, at the top level, are sort of like, preachers in a way. They kind of come out with these general statements, and then the country's really run by officials as you go down the system, provincial officials and others who have quite a lot of, informal authority in their provinces. And so that architecture really runs things in China. And on the whole, there's a lot of devolved authority. I mean, it kind of works. It's mysterious how it works. And I don't really have a good answer to how it works, but it works. I mean, it's orderly when you go there. I mean, it's sort of incredible. But I think that, to kind of finish on a sort of note, I mean, we all you probably read the media in Britain about China, and you may have been sort of a bit surprised what I said today. I've been triple inoculated against Xi Jinping thought, right? I couldn't believe this stuff if you held my head in a fire. I couldn't believe it. So I find it very hilarious that you have people going around Britain saying, oh, God, we're all being brainwashed. You don't seem to me to be people who could be easily brainwashed, right? And I mean, if I was to come in here and, as a Chinese, I mean, you've had the Chinese ambassador here, right? Liu Xiaoming, I mean, did he change your mind? I don't think so, right? I don't think that China is going to kind of try and do that. I think we probably are going to face a China in the future which is going to be more hybrid. And the new leaders in China who are appearing are going to be very different to Xi Jinping. And I think that they're going to probably have influence quicker than we think. They are people who are really formidable administrators. In fact, one of them is an ex-British academic, right? It always cheers me up. I have a hope, right? I can end up in the Politburo in China, right? Chen Jining, who is the party secretary of Shanghai, who was an environmental scientist at Imperial College in the 90s and a research fellow there for a couple of years, a junior lecturer. And he's now gone back to China, and he's in the Politburo. He's one of those 24 people. And, he's 60. He's incredibly urbane. And, well, I mean, he's a politician that people can relate to. And I think there are other people in the system we don't see now, but they're going to create a fundamentally different kind of world. I think moaning and, getting fixated on Xi Jinping is really, really quite comforting because it's quite straightforward, right? I mean, he's like a nasty communist, and it's all very scary. But I wonder what the world will look like when we've got more complicated figures in China who are not so easy to kind of, demonize, and how a China which is in a hybrid sort of political situation is not going to be so easy to dismiss. The only thing I can say is, for the rest of my life, and I mean, for people that I'm teaching today, China's not going to go away. So I guess we just have to sort of live with that and enjoy the world's greatest entertainment of seeing Mr. Xi Jinping have awful fun at Mr. Trump's expense.
Thank you very much. Kerry mentioned the visit of the then ambassador to the United Kingdom on behalf of the Republic of China, Mr. Liu, and I got a lot of prestige from that. but I do recall that when we had a welter of questions, as we had tonight, there was a feeling that he hadn't answered most of them when you left this room. Well, if you want, I think tonight has counteracted that. Not only can you meet Kerry afterwards, if you're, those of you who didn't get his book, I would like to meet him as you leave. But also, Stu, you'll agree with me that we've had a much more revelatory exposure of the Chinese Communist Party from a non-member, and we've had wonderful illumination in the vast range of questions that you've put to him. Deeply grateful to Professor Kerry Brown.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.